So firstly, I'd just like to welcome Graham David onto the Everest Virtual Summit. I'll just bring Graham up now. And he's on his way through. Hello, Graham, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect, we can hear you there, Graham. That's excellent.
Good stuff. Appreciate the introduction there, Matt. How are you?
Yes, very well, thank you. Very well indeed.
Right, so let's crack on. And here's the thing. I don't know if you've ever looked at what it is that people get scared of, people like or don't like, but the number one fear, it's not what people most often think is flying, spiders, snakes, or dying. The number one fear for so many people is speaking publicly. And that, of course, is multiplied by several million when somebody points a camera at you. So in this session, it's a really brief 30-minute session because, let's be honest, it's Friday afternoon, it's sunny, and it's a bank holiday weekend. So delightful, though I know I'm going to be as helpful as I'm going to be over this next 30 minutes. I know that many of us are going to be thinking, what else could we be doing with our time right now? I'm going to tear into the session in just a moment. There's going to be 3 key areas that I'm going to help you with. The first is what I see so many online trainers not getting as good as they should, and that is the beginning and the end of the training session. So often these are areas that are neglected, and I'm going to show you some specific ways in which you can have a better intro and a better outro. I'm then going to move on to look at the difference between how and what you say and how you say it. And that's all about you as a presenter. And a lot of people don't like to see themselves as presenters. They tend to think, well, I'm a trainer, but now I've got to do it on the camera. Or I didn't even want to be a trainer, but something's happened and I've now got to share this knowledge. I'm a subject expert, for example. Or maybe people get a little bit caught up in the whole idea of presenter sounds a little bit like they are somewhat super arrogant. But actually, it's as a specific set of skills like anything else. And I'm going to share with you some really simple things. Whether you are incredibly experienced and you pretty much got this and you think it's a refresher, whether you're brand new, maybe reluctant, or somewhere in the middle, I'm going to give you some actionable points that you can do. I'll give you a bit of homework as well if you fancy rising to the challenge. And the third and final section I'm going to do in this very quick 30 minutes is 5 simple things you can do for better engagement with your audience. So that's the plan. Now, before we get started, Matt, do me a favor. Would you just put on the original title screen, please, for me, just so that I'm a little window in the corner? Is that possible?
Yeah, of course. I'll just launch it up there, so I'll just share my screen with you.
Just while you're doing that, here's what I'd like you to do, please. I'd like you to think of your favorite food item, right? Now, I know that's a slightly weird thing. Matt, I can't see my own self there. I can see you, which is lovely, but I need to see where I am in relation to the camera. Otherwise, it's going to be a little bit tricky. Can you help me with that?
Yeah, of course. You should be able to just choose the show thumbnail video on your screen.
Show the what, sorry?
Show thumbnail. So where I appear,
there you
there
go.
should be 2 boxes.
Yeah, that's fine. Great stuff. Good stuff. Okay, thank you. So, here's what I want you to do. Think of your favorite foods. Now, it doesn't matter what your favorite food is, but think of your favorite food right now. And then what I want you to do is to think of the 3 words that describe your favorite food. It literally doesn't matter what that favorite food is. But I want you to type in, please, into the message bar. Don't send it yet. Type in the 3 words that describe your favorite food. So, as an example, if my favorite food was cheese on toast, my 3 words might be cheesy, hot, and simple. Okay, let's face it, cheese on toast is pretty good, but it is cheesy, it is hot, it is simple. So I'm going to give you literally 15 seconds. The first food that springs to mind is perfect. That food, type in the 3 words that describe that favorite food. I'm going to keep talking because I've got to move on to a lot of content here, but get your 3 words typed in right now, and you've got about 7 seconds more to get those 3 words in that describe your favorite food. I pick cheesy, hot, and simple, and be ready to send these 3 words. So there's the time you've had up until now. Just before you hit send, I want you to go back to the message bar and please add in the words, I am. Okay, so do that for me right now and hit send, please. Matt, just tell me when you get a few of those popping through.
Yeah, we've had absolutely loads coming through.
Okay.
Fantastic ones.
That's some good ones, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely superb.
Excellent. Oh my God. I'm tasty, delicious. I am spicy, comforting, and easy. I'm saucy, rich, and French. I want to talk to that person. Right, so before we go any further, thank you for typing those in. Now, here's the thing. Very often at the start of a training session, people want to do some very quick little activity, some kind of energizer. And there's a lot flying around now. Things like tell somebody something about you that nobody else knows. Now, I have a major issue with that game. No disrespect if you love it, but I always think if nobody else knows that thing about me, keep it to yourself, right? It's too easy to go horribly wrong. It's a little bit like the, I think somebody said to me the other day, what I do just at the start of a session of 10 or 12 delegates, I ask everybody to stand up so I can see what they're wearing. That has the capacity to go horribly wrong. And I'm not being all over the top here and really taking it very, very seriously, but let's try and help our learners to relax into the session. Right? So that particular game I've just played, what a great way to start pretty much any session. Let's say we were doing coaching your colleagues right now, and there was 12 of you. I could put you into 3 or 4 rooms and give you 3 minutes, introduce yourself to each other with those 3 words. That gives you a ha moment, and then you can get into the content. Or I could ask you, if it's a really small group, 4 or 5 people, right, I'm going to give each of you the window for a couple of minutes, introduce yourself and talk us through what you want to get out of the session. The key is, what I want you to do is to engage with something immediately, and I don't want you to feel awkward or embarrassed about it. Now, let's get into these 3 key things that we're going to be talking about. And the first thing I've said I'm going to do is talk about the intro and the outro. So, if I look at the start of the training session, do you see that word clearly there, intro? Matt?
Just about, because your screen's very small, but I can just about see that.
The screen's very small, okay. Put the screen on full if you would now, please. And outro is there, that's perfect, thank you. So I've got my intro and my outro. Now, a lot of people like a little bit of science behind this. So here's a bit of science if this is what you want. You've probably heard of Tony Buzan. This is the guy who's credited with mind maps. He's written, well, I think he passed away a couple of years ago, but he's written hundreds of books, 140 books or something, all about the memory, learning, how we retain information. He's written a very good book about speed reading, very quick read. And one of the things he talks about is how and where in our learners' attention is at its highest. And it will be no surprise to you, I suspect, that at the intro and the outro of any learning session, our learners are most switched on. Now think about this. If you've watched a series of speakers, no matter how good or how bad the previous one was, when the next one starts, you have that little lift of energy, don't you? You have that moment of, oh, okay, let's see what this is going to be about. You have that moment of trying to see what the next stage is going to be. And so at the intro, we can absolutely use this to get our audience's attention immediately. Now, too many trainers will waste this time saying, let me tell you a little bit about our business, or let me tell you about the rationale behind this, or let's agree some of the rules of this online session. Now, if those things are important to you, that's fine. I think one of the worst things that trainers do is they'll walk on and say, right, before we get started, let's talk about me for a bit. And they go through a PowerPoint of all about them. But this opening start of the session, the intro, is one of our most brilliant times to get our audience's attention immediately. So if you do have to introduce yourself, because that's a rule of your business, if you feel it's important to talk about the background to the program, if what you want to do is to go through the rules of the session, but by the way, why not ask your delegates to tell you the rules? What I'm really thinking about here on the intro is always a question is a very powerful, a story, or an activity. Now, these are really simple to do. And if you think back to the start of my training session just now, it was only 10 minutes ago, I used an element of all 3 of these. You don't need to do all 3. You can just start with a question. So think about the difference. If your learners checked into your session and on the screen was, what's the #1 issue facing our business today? Or what would stop you from coaching more of your colleagues more often? Or what ways can you identify to reduce the bottom line? Whatever your question is, you could start with that question right at the beginning of the event. Now, you might then still want to introduce yourself or talk about the session or whatever, but a question has this effect on people's brains right from the start. They know that this is going to be more of a 2-way process. Now, what I love about stories is that too often in corporate training, we can find ourselves going through facts and figures and data. And compliance training is a good example of this, health and safety or some work in HR, because there's a lot of data to get through. But stories have this amazing way of getting into our emotions. Now, I'm sure as learners and trainers, you know about how many senses are there? There's 5 senses, right? If we forget fashion. So we can see stuff, we can hear stuff, we can have an emotional feeling, kinesthetic, visual, audio, and kinesthetic. If we rule out olfactory and gustatory, because you're not going to be smelling or tasting your delegates, then you've got 3 ways to get into your audience's brain. And too many of us rely on a succession of PowerPoint slides. Too many of us rely on, I'll occasionally throw in a hilarious video from YouTube. Too many of us will do things like, here's the theory, now discuss it. Here's the theory, now discuss it. But a story allows us to get into that part of the brain that is a really valuable way to help people start to think about the content, start to think about the idea that you're putting forward. It's a really simple and easy and impactful way for you to drop in an idea. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say this was a session, and I won't tell you the topic in a minute of the session, but let's say this was a training session, and I walked on, and instead of going, okay, I'm going to introduce myself, my name's Graham, and this is where I work, and da-da-da-da-da-da, because at that point, you are going into a pattern. And because you're in a pattern, you're no longer listening. Instead, I walked in and said, a little while ago, a barber, remember those? A barber opened up in a small town. And in order to promote their business, they put posters everywhere that said, opening offer, £1 haircuts. Now, the local barbers were going, what are we going to do? This is a disaster. But the following day, one barber had solved it. Everywhere these posters were up saying £1 haircuts, this existing barber had put up signs saying, we fix £1 haircuts. Now, if I started with that story, this session could have been on sales, it could have been on marketing, it could have been on agile thinking, it could have been on leadership, it could have been on a number of things. So by dropping the story and letting you come up to your conclusions, it's a great way to launch the topic. And finally, an activity, getting you to do something. So I mentioned explaining the rules of the session. Why do so many trainers do that? Why don't we instead say, get into small groups and come back with the 3 things you want to get out of today's session? Or get into small groups and let's agree how we're going to be working over these series of courses we've got over the next 5 weeks. We can get our audience to do an awful lot, and we can mix these 3: questions, stories, and activities. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you just to consider these, and for any questions, comments, or observations you might have, to type them in. I'll give you a 30-second break to do that. But just before we do, let's also look at the outro. So the outro, I'm going to suggest there are 3 key things that I always do at the end of an online training session. The first is I'm always going to do a CTA, a call to action. So I don't want to put up a slide that says, this is what we covered today. Because the moment you do that, your audience starts switching off, because they know what we covered, because they heard it, and they stop listening, even though they don't remember it all. But if I say to people, small groups, that's 10 of you, get into small groups, pick the one thing that you are definitely going to put into place as a result of this course. I want to move it from passively watching on the screen to doing it live. And I want you to identify that one thing. Now, so far already, there's probably some of you statistically who are thinking, I'm going to try that. There's potentially some of you thinking, I already know that. But what I want to do is to move you from just telling you to doing something. So I always want to put a call to action at the end. The second thing I always want to do is to notice your involvement and your engagement. Too many trainers will say, thanks so much, that's been great, blah, blah, blah. But I always want to type in, I always want to say, I appreciate your time, your challenges, your questions, your effort. Even if the audience has been quiet. And the reason for this is I'm starting to train the audience. That train's the wrong word, but I'm training the audience. This is going to be a 2-way process. The final thing that I'm always going to do, the last words out of my mouth are always going to be, thank you. Not thanks, not cheers, not lovely to talk to you, but always thank you. I might say those other things, but thank you is a really nice, clear, full stop to the session. Now, before we move on to section 2 of these 3 sections, just take a moment, 30 seconds, any questions, comments, or observations you have about the intro, the outro, or indeed anything I've talked about so far. 30 seconds, get started, please. Okay, just 15 more seconds. We will have some questions and answers at the end, but if you have any questions or comments, observations, just type them in right now. And I will deal with as many of those as I possibly can as we get towards the end. Love the energy, love the 30-second pause, thank you. Yeah, 30-second pause, by the way. See, I'm quite a fast tempo rhythm person, you may have noticed, which is why sometimes I've got to slow it down a bit. And I sometimes need to give you time to process what I've just said. And it's easy when we're doing stuff to be thinking we've got to be loads of energy. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Okay, there's your 30 seconds. Let's move on to the second section, which is the difference between how and what. So, these two words, that's a terrible colour to use, isn't it? Let's use blue. How, Matt, can you see that?
Yep.
Good stuff. So, how and what? Now, most online trainers, I can't speak for you because I've not seen you train, but most online speakers get really caught up in what. And sometimes this isn't our fault. Sometimes the client says, I want you to cover this, 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 and this. And by the way, you've got 45 minutes, okay? This particular topic we're talking about now, I could talk about 5 days for it, pretty much non-stop without repetition. But we've got 30 minutes. So a lot of trainers get caught up in what I'm going to tell you. The phrase cover off is used quite a lot. And by the way, have you ever noticed how sometimes you just about manage to fit in the stuff you've got to fit into your course time, and then you get an email from somebody very senior who goes, oh, I understand you're doing this. Would you mind just dropping in some of these slides for me? Really helpful. And people get caught up in the what. But I'm going to urge you to consider the how. Because the shocking breaking news is this: how you present is of equal importance to what you present. Now, a lot of people don't really like to consider that, and when they do consider it, they think, no, 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 it's all about the what. It isn't. It's of equal importance how you put the information across. Now, whether you pre-teach, whether you ask questions, whether you show slides, whether you put an infographic on, whether you're talking as I am now, whatever it is you do is absolutely fine. But the two things that are most under your control are your performance, and I am using the word performance, and your relationship and closeness to the camera. You see, if I take a step back, this feels very different all of a sudden, doesn't it? And if we're having a small discussion, again, let's say 10, 12 people, and somebody's on the camera now and asking me a question, I can demonstrate that I'm listening. You know how horrible it is when you ask a question and it goes out into cyberspace and you don't know if the other guy's listening. It's horrible. So actually, I've set this space up here so I can create different moods just by moving. And the interesting thing is I'm a very gestural speaker, so I need to be able to see my hands. That's how I work. But isn't it great if I need to emphasize a point? I can come right up close to you, way closer than I could live, because questions would be asked if I got this close to you live. But I can then change the pace and the tone very fast, which is the second part to how we do this. One is your position to your camera. If you're currently presenting in the kitchen, where it's between the back door and the bin and a pile of books to make it look like you're learned, right? That's a terrible position. If that's all you've got, that's what you've got. But ideally, the position to move or the ability to be able to do things helps. I can take myself right off the camera, no problem at all whatsoever. But if you've never checked where you are and how your picture looks, you won't know you're no longer on the camera, which is no good. So a little bit of rehearsal up front is helpful, but also the way in which you speak and put the information across. So you've noticed that I've got lots of energy when I speak. But you've also noticed that sometimes I stop talking. And the weird thing is that when you slow it right down, if you're a very fast speaker, as I am, your audience, virtually or otherwise, listens in a little bit. This doesn't work if you've just got a static slide up, because if you've got a static slide up, it just looks like this. And you come to the conclusion that something's wrong with your connection. But if you've just asked me a question, you can really let it go a bit. You can really make people hang on to your every word. So as we get to the end of section 2, there's another 30-second pause coming up right now for your questions, comments, and observations before we go into the final part about engagement. I want you to consider this. How do you improve your position with the camera, your use of the camera? Because let's be honest, this looks like you and I are talking, right? I'm looking straight at you. So how is it that I'm doing that? Well, I'm doing it through the bit of homework that I'm going to suggest you consider. I'm inviting you to take this homework on. I'd like you over the next week, at least once per day, to film yourself for 2 or 3 minutes and get used to how you look and sound. Now, this is a hideous thing, as I said right at the start. People would do pretty much anything rather than review their own performance on camera. There is something worse, by the way, getting your family around to sit and watch you on camera, or your partner, because you know how supportive they'll be, right? How do I look? You look fat. What? You're losing your head. What? No, don't. Here's the thing. My left eye is smaller than my right eye. My mouth moves in a slightly weird angle like that when I talk. I wave my arms around too much. Sometimes I speak too fast. It's really hard to get a nice photo of me because I'm so over-animated. But I know all those things because I've seen myself on camera a lot. And the value to me as an online trainer is I can review my performance dispassionately. I can look at what I've done well and what I need to improve. So the homework, should you decide to consider it, is you watch and review yourself over a period of days and start to notice the things you're doing well. Ultimately, all you're trying to do is to replicate you on a good day, but on camera and talking about work. It's not about your accent, how you stand. However you are is absolutely fine, but get used to seeing it. So, got 30 seconds before we come to this final session. 30 seconds, any questions, comments, or observations, drop those in, and then we'll pick up with 5 simple ways to be more engaging. Get going, please, 30 seconds. Okay, just 10 more seconds. And Matt, I want you to be ready on the subtle cue that I give you when I say now to do the thing we talked about, which will be the second one. When we're ready, Matt, it's dead subtle. Nobody else will know that's what we're doing. Okay, so welcome back. We've just been talking about the intro, the outro. We've been talking about the how and the what. Let's go into this final session of 5 things you can do to be more engaging. Now, Matt!
If I can remember what it was, that'd be great.
Oh man, slide 2, please. Oh dear, that was just like you can't see the machinery of this, can you? It's just so instant, so fast. We're having slide 2. Or we're not having? Oh, yeah, having slide 2. Fantastic. There we go. Good stuff. Okay, so 5 ways to be more engaging. Really simple things to do. Now, the first one says be on camera a lot more, and I've just put a slide up. What is going on? I'll get onto that in point 2. But point 1 is really simple. I don't know how you present. I don't know what you currently do when you present, but the single thing you can do now is to be on camera more. If you've got slides that say, this is my name and this is who I am and this is where I've worked, quite apart from the fact, I'm sorry to break this to you, if it's what you're doing, no one cares. That's not flippant, it's true. Apart from that, why don't you stand up and say who you are? If you want to talk about your credibility, positioning, and I get that. If you want to introduce yourself, if you want to say, okay, the reason we're doing it, do it live. You've got to do it live. The more you do on camera, the more engaging it is, because now we're talking. We're not looking at static slides. The second point I want you to consider relates to why we're now on a slide. And if you're into neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, you'll know about pattern interrupts. I referred to patterns earlier. You see, we all get into patterns. Our brains evolved to be patterns because this lower part of the brain here is looking for movement. And it's looking for movement because millions and millions of years ago, movement went meant one of three things. There was something we had to run away from, there was something we had to eat, or there's something we had to mate with, right? And our upper brain is protected by that first part of the brain sorting it. It's why, if you remember driving to work, you sometimes think, how did I get here? I don't remember the journey. It's why sometimes people get caught up in relationships or in jobs for years and years and years without really considering why. But a training session online is much like that in miniature, because slide after slide after slide after slide after slide becomes very similar. It becomes a pattern. This lower part of the brain is, there's nothing changing. There's nothing to worry about. Just ignore it. This is why sometimes, and you've seen this, it may have happened to you, you can be on an audio conference and the speaker will go, so Dave, what do you think? There then follows a terrible pause. And we know that Dave wasn't listening. And Dave will go, yeah, just really good points, actually. I'm just trying to consolidate it in my brain. I'm just making some notes. Could somebody else pick up that question first, please? And Dave tries to get away with it. So we've all experienced that. So interrupting the pattern, this is why I talk about you as a speaker, is a great way to force that engagement. Point 3, what would happen if you asked more questions? I mean, how easy would it be for you to drop some questions into your script? How could your audience suddenly find themselves, even if they're not answering questions or polls, starting to hook back into what you say? You see, what have you noticed about what happens when you ask questions? How have you seen people's reactions change simply by asking the question? Questions are fabulous. Use them right at the start and absolutely pepper them throughout your presentation. And point 4, linked with questions, is that you as a speaker have got to start doing less. You as a trainer have got to start doing less. It's too easy to spoon feed our audience everything. But the times when you really figure it and learn it and understand it and get it are the times you've done a little bit of thinking yourself, you've worked it out. It's when you come away from the session, you have a learning group, a learning action group, and a week later you come back and catch up on what you've been talking about. The more we can get our delegates to do, the better. And point 5 ties up everything I've been talking about. I want you to start thinking of yourself as a presenter. There is nothing inherently natural in what I'm doing right now. I'm stood in a home studio with a whiteboard talking to a camera just here. I have notes and I have script and I have other supporting stuff around me, but this is purely studio. There's nothing natural about this. And so being a presenter is much like any other skill. It takes a little bit of practice, just like learning Excel or learning to drive. It might be easier for you or harder for you. You don't need to be anybody else. You can be yourself, but you do need to learn some basics of presenting. Now, those are the 3 key areas that I wanted to cover with you. But we've got about 15 minutes of Q&A. Before we get into the Q&A, Matt, would you please put up the final slide? So sometimes people really like my style of presenting. Sometimes people hate it, but wherever you are on that list, if you do want to talk to me after this session, my name's Graham David. There's a couple of websites there, Graham David and Blue Beetle, you can find me. The best way to track me down is on LinkedIn. I'm really active on LinkedIn, and you can see on the link there, it's Graham David 1. I found the easiest way to find it from the search bar. So type in my name and then start to type in Blue Beetle. And there's that picture of me doing my Zoolander blue steel expression just below. So if you want to find me, simplest thing to do is go into LinkedIn, Graham David Blue Beetle, and that picture should come up and that'll be me. I'll be delighted to connect to you and I'll be delighted to answer your questions or to help you in the future. So I think we are at that point. I'm going to, of course, get to my pre-planned outro that you know about at the end of the questions, which is in about 12 to 13 minutes. So, Matt, how are we going to do questions?
Yeah, so we've had loads of questions coming through the Q&A, so I'll just go through a few. What is your favourite activity for online engagement? You can pick all of your activities. What's your favourite one?
My favourite activity? All right, fine. So my favourite activity is really, okay, so I really like what I talked about with the call to action. I've lost it now, there we go, the call to action. So my favourite thing to do is, because it does a summary and it gets audience talking and it actually moves them along to doing something. So in a typical training room online of, let's say, 20 people, at the end of the session, 4 groups of 5, 5 groups of 4, I want you to talk about everything we've covered today, right? That's the do less principle. And I want you to, as a group, as an individual, pick the one thing you're going to put into place. And what that does in 3 minutes is it forces 4 or 5 people to talk, it forces them to review the content between themselves, and it forces them each to agree something. Plus, they've said it in the groups, they're more likely to do it.
So, we had a question come through. This was originally, let me find it again here. I'll put that one up in a second. Quick question in terms of recording. Loads of people asked about the recording. Yes, we will share this as well.
Thank you.
The question is, should trainers sit or stand when delivering a session? I reckon we'll answer that one quite quickly.
Absolutely should stand. I get achy like everybody else does, but I've got 10 sessions over the next 2 weeks I'm delivering. I've got a fortnight off, and I've then got 50 sessions booked in 5 weeks. I'm going to do all that on my feet. It's going to hurt, but you just have the flexibility to do something you don't have if you sat down.
Lovely. And there's a question that came through from Gavin, and this came through from a couple of people, but Gavin was interrupted by his girlfriend, apparently. Can you recap the notice bit on the outro, I believe?
Sorry, the what bit?
The notice on the outro.
Yeah, absolutely.
Recap that. When a few people asked that.
Yeah, okay. So what I want to do, I do this live, and I think it's even more important online. I want to notice your engagement. So whether I've got, I don't know how many people we have today, whether I've got 10, 15, 20 people, 500 people, I want to thank you for your engagement, for your questions, for your challenge. I want to acknowledge your input to this session. The theory behind that is really simple. First, it's just polite. But 2, more importantly, it's starting to teach you over a period of time that when we work together, we're going to do this together. I'm not going to do everything for you. I'll help you as much as I can, but I expect you to put questions in. I expect you to do the things that you've said you'll do. So notice on a longer term basis, Gavin, is all about getting your audience to realise that you can't do training by yourself. I can't bear that training where you log in and it's 45 minutes of a series of still slides, because it's just difficult. It's just difficult to watch it, and particularly if the speaker's got a boring voice because they're sat in the kitchen drinking Horlicks at the time. So yeah, that's what Notice is about.
Excellent. And a couple of questions on this topic as well. How would you encourage shy people to take part in the session? How would you encourage that? Okay,
so great question. Thank you for that. Who asked that question?
This was anonymous.
Oh, okay, fine. Brilliant. Thank you, whoever that was. So it's an interesting question. Often people who hire trainers, who hire me, the client will say, how are you going to ensure that everybody's going to get involved? Well, you can get involved on multiple levels. So actually, whether it's a live session or an online session, what I've learned is that whether people do the things you are asking them to do isn't really the point. Now, if you ask them to do something embarrassing, like to go around and, you know that thing, go around and introduce yourself and talk about yourself, oh my God, it's death by 1,000 cuts. I hate that game, right? I'm definitely not shy. I hate that game. So what I want to do is to create an environment where you can get involved and join in without doing anything particularly difficult. So the food with the 3 adjectives is a good example. It doesn't really matter what you type in. And if you don't want to play, you don't play. If I ask you to go into a small group and talk, it's a lot easier, particularly if you don't like the idea of talking in front of everybody, to have a chat. But ultimately, the fact that you're there and you're engaging or you're typing in covers as many of the bases as you can. I can't force you to join in if you don't want to join in.
And a couple of questions for yourself. In terms of your presentation styles, a couple of people say they lack confidence in presenting. 1, have you always been this comfortable presenting? And 2, do you have any tips to overcome nerves to be able to present in your style? Okay, so when I was 15, I was incredibly shy, and it sounds like an epiphany and lights coming from above. And I literally decided one day, God, this is depressing. And I remember going with my mate James to go and talk to Penelope and Alison, who were also at my school. I remember my heart was doing this and everything. And I remember deciding I'm going to be confident. So if you want the really short, brutal answer, you've got to pretend to be confident. Am I now naturally confident? Yeah, I spent a bit of time making myself confident. And one of the reasons I've suggested the homework
is because the more you see yourself online, the quicker you can move away from thinking, oh God, the angle's wrong. My chin looks a bit big. I should have shaved again. Oh, my shirt, why did I wear that one? You move away from that. You're actually able to focus on the technique and the quality of what you're doing. In terms of getting more confidence, it's a number of things. Part of it is choosing to be more confident. Part of it is realizing that the bar for many online trainers is so low that even if you just ditch half of your PowerPoint slides, you could be way better than a lot of people. And the key to this is actually learning from social media, and not just grown-up stuff like Facebook or LinkedIn. You can actually learn a load from TikTok, believe it or not. Now, I know you've heard of TikTok, even though professionally you've got, oh, it's just for the kids. But you like watching TikTok the same as everybody else does. The thing about TikTok and LinkedIn and Facebook and everything else is that the current vogue is to be yourself, be authentic, be really you. Now, on a professional network, I'm going to guide a little bit of caution about how you really are, but actually you can be a lot more you than you really think. So if you're quite a quiet person, there's nothing wrong with that. And actually, if you find it really difficult to be loud and explosive, you shouldn't be loud and explosive. If the greatest strength you've got is the ability to articulate your idea and to take your audience with you, that's what you should do. I hope that makes sense.
Brilliant. And then I suppose a couple of technical questions in terms of people who are running training that might be a bit more technical. How do you manage it where there are a lot of slides, a lot of diagrams to be showing on screen, a lot of information? How would you manage that particular type of training session?
So my specialism tends to be towards behaviour. I do a lot of theory with, I've got a lot of stuff I'm doing next week and the weeks after actually for a whole series of the management populations. And in order to go through some of the behaviours I want to look at, I am backing that up with theory and with some standard tools, tips and techniques. I am going to scribble on a whiteboard. But the other thing that's a really good idea is to send the theory or the diagrams or the data to your audience in advance. Now, there's nothing to stop us doing that, except that traditionally as trainers, we want to keep the information for ourselves. So I don't want you to know it until I've explained it. Actually, everything's available online anyway. So when I talk to HR professionals, when I talk to managers about HR skills, I send them all of the stuff up front and say, make sure you know this for the course. Then we don't waste time explaining it. Now, I can answer questions about it. If I have to pull up a slide, I will. But it's more about how they use it.
Very interesting. There's a few questions about your setup, where you put your camera. Is it a separate camera? Do you have a separate microphone? I think someone said, can you show us your setup? So I don't even know if you can do that. But any more tips around how you would set up a room around you distance? So.
Okay, so I don't know if I can show you my setup. I will talk you through my setup. I hope that will help. I've got a rug here, right? I've got a rug because it just makes it a little bit softer when I walk. And because it's so hot, I happen to be in bare feet. But if you're in shoes and we can hear you clip-clopping around all the time, that's not so good. For my setup, I want to make sure I can see the whiteboard. And I do sometimes use a second camera, in which case on something like Zoom, you plug in the second camera. And some of the courses I'm doing next week, I'm having a second camera just on the whiteboard. So effectively, I'm having a studio over here where I can talk and I can control the studio. And then I'll step over here to a second camera for the whiteboard. I always have water just out of shot, because that's very, very helpful when you're talking, particularly if you get a little bit of energy going with it. I also always have a hard copy of all the notes that I'm going to do, because despite the fact that I've been speaking passionately and fully for 45 minutes without notes, I've got notes. I also have an off-stage area. Now, in the off-stage area, I can see you and I can see my screen. Oops, there's my head, but you can't see me. And that's also really important because it allows me to go and check stuff. Plus, if I've got a lot of technical work, I put that just over there as well.
Brilliant. We've had loads of questions just coming through here. I'm just trying to find some more. Yeah, in terms of, there's a question here about how would you manage a long session? So if a session was supposed longer than 2-3 hours, how would you manage that engagement? Is there any tips and tricks for longer online sessions?
Okay, so the longest session I tend to do online is 2 hours. Most delegates want about 90 minutes. Much more than that becomes very, very difficult. But I've got a client coming up who wants 90 minutes in the morning, 90 minutes in the afternoon. So actually, this is where the do less principle comes in, because we do something before. You go, I want you to arrive having thought about, answered X, Y, and Z. And this isn't, endless booklets with thousands of things to fill in, because that's not really online training. That's, can you do a bunch of stuff and then can you bring it to the camera? Part of the engagement is we keep changing it. So it's the pattern interrupt idea. I'm going to ask you to do something. I'm going to explain something. So if I've just explained this and we're now talking about it, so we've been going 45 minutes now. Oh, my clock's down there, I should have explained. So the second thing that I'm then going to do is say, right, so having talked about intro, outro, what, how, and those 5 things, I've done that in a very compressed time. I might talk about each of those for 15, 20 minutes, and then I might break you into small groups and get you to actually put some of those things into practice. If it was an acronym for delivering bad news to somebody, then I might ask you to work in groups of 2 on a real problem. So in other words, we keep chopping and changing. What would stop you if it was a long session saying, listen, I'll tell you what, we've got another hour to go. Let's have a 5-minute comfort break. Go away, find the coffee, find the bathrooms, and come back. But when you come back, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. So what you do is you keep shifting and changing and twisting and altering things.
Excellent. And I think we are just approaching Q2 here. So is there anything you want to wrap up before the end?
So inevitably there's going to be. Listen, I'm not going to run through all the bits and pieces we've done, because if we did, it would mean putting up a summary slide, and I'm hoping for now, that's not my style. I mean, if I was, I'd be talking about the intro and the questions and the activity and the story, and the outro with the call to action. I'd be talking about noticing your delegates, and I'd be talking about saying thank you at the very end so people know it's finished. That's what I'll be talking about at the start. I strongly advise, if one of those really appeals to you, you think about it. The middle section, if you remember, we spoke about the what and the how. And the how is the thing that is sadly neglected by most people. So why not consider taking a little bit of homework and just filming yourself, getting a look back and getting a hang of what you look like online. It's not as bad as you think. And once you see it and you get used to it, that's just what it is. And finally, I gave you 5 key ways to increase your engagement. And I'd urge you, if 1 or 2 of those appeal to you, make a go at it and go for those. So those are the key things we've done. Really appreciate it. I can see on the questions here, it says 99 plus, so I assume you've gone way past that now. Really appreciate all your questions, really appreciate all your inputs. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you. But for now, from me, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Graham. Really appreciate it.